China's transformation from a poor agrarian society into the world's second largest economy lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty. And since 2012, under President Xi Jinping's targeted or precision poverty alleviation campaign, nearly 100 million of the intractably poor, most living in remote mountain villages, have been also lifted out of extreme poverty. It has required sustained national commitment, and officials at all levels of government have been put under great pressure. Officials could not be promoted until they achieved their poverty alleviation goals. But with career stakes high and funding vast, what about cheating and stealing? Have officials falsified poverty data to please superiors? Have officials diverted public funds for private gain? How has the Chinese government uncovered such perfidy and deceit? Moreover, China met its poverty alleviation goal in 2020, but how can it ensure that its poverty alleviation stands the test of time and its success be sustained? That's the question for Closer to China. Across rural China, hundreds of billions of yuan have been spent and millions of officials have been mobilized in a massive poverty alleviation campaign. To ensure that help is reaching those most in need, groups of independent inspectors are regularly dispatched to conduct on-the-ground investigations in some of the poorest areas of the country. These are the third-party evaluation teams.
当我第一次做到这份工作的时候，给我的印象是非常的震撼的。我觉得哇，居然还有老百姓住这样的房子，吃这样的水。我想通过自己的一些努力来去帮助更多的一些贫困户。
They undertook a long and difficult journey to Pingshan County, in one of the poorest and most remote areas of Sichuan Province.
基本上我都是走的一些边边角角的，然后我抽到的组基本上都是罪人的。有的人可能觉得我们太年轻，你随便查，反正你也查不出什么问题。但是，我已经做这个工作有3年了，我积累了一定的经验。在评判一些问题户的时候，也有自己的一套客观公正的一个标准。
The information Ma Yang gathered from the family and from his colleagues' observations of their living conditions will be verified in a follow-up investigation.
各片区在调查过程之中的话，就大家有没有难以判断的这种，我们拿出来一起讨论一下。所有的组记清楚，提供的问题或者材料必须要有充足的证据。 充足的证据，我们要让地方服气。没有。
China has been building a database of poor households since 2014. Those included in it receive help. But since local officials have a big say in who gets support, the targeting is not always impartial or assessed properly.
就我们政府有没有跟你说过？ 你给1万块钱来改造这个事情，说过啊，这个事情是说过的是吧？哦，你是自己不，你自己不愿意？
不，因为的话，我现在也没能力的，老板你1万块钱，改了也改一凑合，你要啥子噻？2万块钱咋不改一凑合？
你想进去举节目嘛？
新款都求肯定先去举这件噻。
但是原来他也不行，他说做专家原来是这样嘛，就原来是这样子嘛，他也不行嘛。
书记来过你屋头没有？
来过
的哈，
走的来过
的哈。
具体点那些都是店，
这样就不要说了，
这是2店是92地的店。
大家的意愿是啥子？那么远了，
他不愿意下去，他
我都是农村人，远很了，不愿意跟你做，
种庄稼不方便。
对。
Officials found to be failing the local poor are ordered to address problems as a matter of urgency.
非常辛苦，这个基层事情多，千头万绪，特别脱贫攻坚任务非常艰巨，压力大。
加固，
违反加固。
加固钱到位没有嘛？
没有，被他们考就报警，没有。
这才有看没有？
我头3天去的。
脱贫没有？
脱贫了，就是简直脱贫。
那个其实配的打，那是
他可能是一批的。
不是一批连手的。
他们跟我说1000年脱贫，嘎，我就说这1000年还没给我打那个。
那以前不可能哪个给你克扣的？
不会克扣，
哪个都不敢。说那种的，这是政策性的东西，哪个？
反正
没啥子。
1万。
我这漏水1万块就是改造，就是。
加固。
那么我们房子还漏得很呢，而且有别弄来从2楼有1万多块钱补助，你知道吗？我家房子都漏得很。
你是不是贫困户？
我们不是扶贫，我的儿是一家公不是当兵修来的，我只有5000块钱那个补助的。
补助了一次的嘛。
补助一次的。
不是2楼是漏得很，这漏得很。
50块，
不能重复享受，政策不能重复享受。
好，谢谢。
啊，谢谢你们喽。
没有。
啊，谢谢你们的关系哈。
带着的是一种情怀和责任，还有一种使命，来回1-2个小时的这种山路，那么我们一定要去找到这户，如果他是漏贫的话。
Third-party evaluation is a vital part of China's efforts to help these people. Organized by the State Council Office of Poverty Alleviation, evaluation teams go out every year since 2016 to assess the effectiveness of party and government officials from the provincial level down to the village level. The simple objective is to ensure that the benefits of the government's poverty alleviation campaign are reaching the poorest people in China.
For each poor county to be noted as having gotten out of poverty, it must go through a strict third-party evaluation. Oftentimes, we run a random sampling of over 1,000 households in one poor county, among which maybe 600 have been lifted out of poverty, 400 on the brink.
I have taken part in the evaluation process for 3 years now. It focuses on several aspects. First and foremost, whether or not the household's income meets the threshold. Security measures related to drinking water, housing, education, and healthcare are taken into consideration. The evaluation monitors and measures the enforcement of relevant policies as well. For example, whether central policies on microcredit, training, and stationed assistance have been accordingly carried out. We investigate whether or not local governments have plans or arrangements to sustain local poverty alleviation efforts. We also check on graduated counties' responses, if they've realized results, how they view the policies, and if they're satisfied with the assistance provided. All these factors are taken into consideration.
What is the National Poverty Survey and what are the results? How can results that are falsified be uncovered? And are their officials being punished and why?
The monitoring and evaluation of the program covers a large swath of form and content. Local governments and poverty relief authorities monitor project progress, target fulfillment, and policy enforcement. There's also regular and irregular supervision from party and government organizations. The audit is worth noting. For instance, during the height of the anti-poverty battle, audit departments had quarterly audits for poverty relief programs and policies. It's essentially another form of supervision. Then there's the inspection and supervision carried out by the National People's Congress and National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. Additionally, there's a dedicated evaluation of poverty relief performance and graduation of poor counties observed by third parties and social supervision from media. Supervision from these 5 sources has different implications for the fulfillment of poverty relief and policy enforcement. I think this is a critical feature of China. It is an integration of internal and external supervision, evaluation of both results and process. To a certain degree, it's supposed to identify problems earlier.
村干部评了自己的儿子，评过不？我们精准识别的这个标准里面，村干部家庭有直系亲属是村干部的，能不能评过不？不能评过。那为啥子没请进出去？
因为当时我也是在乡上，在乡上， 有个种子办那边的，设备标准那种不说了，只说是它是因病的话，因病的话是他的前妻叫啥名字啊？有个离婚的那个。
前妻还是母亲？你刚才这个书记说的是母亲，有
他的
母亲近2年长期的病，今年17年我在县医院。
他母亲患有尿结石，已于16年医治，享有新农活。你们认不认账？这个问题，这户的。
反正家庭条件是。
家庭条件现在工资性收入是，据其本人描述的话是2万，经营收入是1080，合计家庭人均纯收入是5270，肯定是高于国家贫困标准线。这种家庭的话，能不能评贫困户？这个与我们村干部亲属是不能评。村干部的直系亲属是不能评的，是吧？那这户就是错评。
This survey was conducted in 2018. In the same year, China's National Audit Office released a report stating that local governments recovered about 15 billion yuan, or about $2.2 billion, which had been misappropriated, and they imposed 649 disciplinary punishments. In 2020, as a result of random inspections, the National Audit Report stated that only 1.5% of poverty alleviation funds had been used improperly, a sharp decrease from 2016.
I believe it is credible since we have multiple mechanisms in place. Take poor households, for example. If they do not see evaluation results, they could always file complaints or report through various channels. Moreover, to graduate from poverty, it takes multiple rounds of evaluation. For instance, if a poor county wants to graduate, first there's independent evaluation carried out at the county level. Then random evaluations conducted at the municipal and provincial levels where third parties, mainly faculties and students from universities and R&D institutions, are invited to take part. The state also organizes spot checks. With all these checks and evaluations, even though we cannot guarantee it's absolutely error-free, I believe quality is largely assured.
In China's sustained targeted poverty alleviation campaign, how serious have been the two big problems? One, corruption in all its forms, such as outright embezzlement of funds and diverting funds for vanity projects. And two, falsification of data to make local officials look good.
We may find falsification of data during internal audits for local governments, but it is quite rare in poverty alleviation evaluations, which take place at the final stage. Though it isn't as if it doesn't exist. It is more common in the initial stages of some projects. It also applies to the diversion of funds. Targeted poverty alleviation has been carried out since the end of 2013. In the very beginning, we did find earmarked funds had been embezzled or diverted, but as the central government tightened the grip on funds with strict management mechanisms, it became increasingly difficult to play foul. Moreover, quarterly audits make malpractice easy to be spotted. Generally speaking, embezzlement today is at a historic low, far less than what we had decades ago.
The annual season may be over for picking tongjiao, translated as rattan pepper, a type of citron green pepper. But workers tending to the plants here, trimming them and applying pesticides, are still getting paid. Leading enterprises here have a guaranteed purchase policy with cooperatives or farmers. They agree to buy rattan pepper at a price that is higher than its costs, even when market prices fall below costs. Local authorities are already looking beyond 2020 to find ways to reduce relative poverty. Relative poverty is defined as when people's income fails to keep up with standards of living set by the society in which they live. What percentage of formerly poor people are vulnerable to falling back into poverty?
According to the data collected by the State Council Leading Group Office of Poverty Alleviation and Development at the end of 2019, among those lifted out of poverty, roughly 2 million do not have a stable income. Some 3 million live slightly above the poverty line, vulnerable to falling back into poverty. We first hope to identify people whose income could snowdive or expenses skyrocket with big data on healthcare, education, and transportation.
For people who just escaped poverty but are still on shaky ground, or those not registered as poor but on the brink of poverty, we need to set up a dedicated mechanism to prevent them from falling back or slipping into poverty. One way is to roll out regulations on relevant arrangements, including identification and registration. Also, it is about offering tailored assistance in light of specific causes and timely adjustment as conditions change. Personally, I think such a mechanism, to a certain extent, can establish a sound foundation for consolidating poverty alleviation results for the future.
Can the success of poverty alleviation be sustained? How?
A mainstream mindset follows what General Secretary Xi Jinping proposed to give them a leg up to get them going. After the over 90 million registered poor get lifted out of poverty, we need to establish mechanisms to prevent them from falling back into poverty. For the lowest income earners, we will also continue to offer favorable policies and measures to give them a leg up.
How to empower the poor to prevent them from being trapped in poverty? Is more reform needed? How might such reform work?
Our poverty alleviation campaign focuses more on self-development capabilities, including stimulating endogenous power. That is, poverty alleviation requires a change of attitude. It is meant to give the poor the will to get out of poverty, rather than forcing them to do so. Second, it also takes capability. We assist the poor to access training on technology and managerial expertise to better sustain poverty alleviation industries or land the jobs they want in the labor market. This can sustain poverty alleviation efforts.
Will the preference measures continue after the campaign, or will there be other measures?
The Chinese government remains committed to poor regions and the poor in terms of policies, assistance, responsibilities, and regulations. In other words, the state will continue to support poor households and poor regions with relevant policies. As far as I know, the time frame is at least 5 years. Before 2025, no changes in policy are expected. It is rather clear. China has also made it clear that after 2020, a strategic shift will be made from targeting absolute poverty to targeting relative poverty.
In Premier Li Keqiang's press conference following the 2020 National People's Congress, he stated that about 600 million Chinese people still live with a monthly income of 1,000 yuan or less. Although they are no longer living in extreme poverty, and they are thankful for that, by any standards, certainly by the standards of China's contemporary urbanites, they are still poor. What's your comment or analysis?
Relative poverty is a problem for all countries, including developed economies. It refers to a condition where household income is a certain percentage below the median income. For example, the threshold for relative poverty in EU countries is set at 40% of median incomes. Relative poverty exists as long as there is a wealth gap. It is a long-term task to alleviate relative poverty by narrowing the wealth gap.
How to evaluate the significance of poverty alleviation to China?
Because for the stable of economic growth, for why we need the growth, why we need the development, right? We need everybody become happier, right? If a small group will become richer, happier, a lot of people were unhappy, and later it's not sustainable. So I think the way in the past, particularly in the past 10 years, put the poverty reduction become top priority. This, I think, is quite effective. Really, because I'm working in this area, I visit every month or not every week. I visit the poverty area. I talk with other people. I observe the big change of those things. I think that experience also, I'm not sure 100% transfer to other countries, but at least can have some impact, because if government is serious, if we have really have the enough the power, it's possible can every family identified can gradually reducing it, right? But in any case, poverty reduction is a long journey. It's not like within a few years you can change it. China already make a 40 years effort, big effort.
After 2020, what's next?
Moving to the next stage, we will confront greater challenges to address relative poverty, as it involves more people with complicated contributing factors. It is relatively more difficult to resolve, and we cannot simply copy measures and policies from our past battles against poverty. Undoubtedly, exploring new policies and measures will be paramount for eliminating relative poverty after 2020. Addressing relative poverty is a long-term task, which cannot rely on short-term policies. It takes relevant laws, mechanisms and policy systems to empower those in relative poverty to enhance their capabilities and improve their conditions. Take the vulnerable group of the relatively poor, for example. Undoubtedly, we need to improve the social security system for them. In addition, for problems affecting a majority of the relatively poor, like issues involving basic public services, education, healthcare, and social security, we may need to build inclusive developmental policies by raising standards. This is the direction we'll take. Pathwise, we do not have much experience in alleviating relative poverty nationwide. Other countries, Western countries in particular, have accumulated rich experience with the matter. And coastal areas in eastern China have also adopted some measures in alleviating relative poverty over the past 10 years or longer periods. These trials and tribulations could undoubtedly serve as valuable references for us to establish a long-term mechanism to alleviate relative poverty nationwide.
China is committed to preventing fraud and corruption, especially in poverty alleviation. Of the 122,100 cases of corruption in 2017, 48,700, more than one-third, related to poverty work. Good for the government in releasing these unflattering statistics. China will not allow falsifying data or misappropriating funds to undermine its poverty alleviation goals. China has instituted tough, independent assessment and evaluation, including an unprecedented national survey, to make sure that officials care more for the people for whom they are responsible than for their superiors to whom they report. As one township party secretary told me, now we face not only several levels of cross-examination, but also expert third-party evaluation. There is strict accountability and punishment. Perhaps the most pressing socioeconomic challenge facing China is the developmental gap between rural and urban regions. Despite decades of prioritizing rural poverty alleviation, still there are tens of millions of peasants living in relative poverty, with standards of living far lower than their urban peers. Now, as 2020 has concluded with the eradication of all extreme poverty, which had clearly defined metrics, China now faces the even more daunting task of rebalancing systemic income disparities, assisting those living in relative poverty, a harder task. To assess the real China, track China's policy on poverty to be closer to China.